hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Hi, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Having some technical difficulties here. So I just want to introduce everybody to Natalya Mytareva, who's going to be speaking to us about the CCHI's project, which is their EtoE interpreter testing campaign. It's very interesting and really useful for everybody in the interpreting world. So today we've invited both interpreters and language companies to this webinar just to spread the word as much as possible. So Natalya, take it away.
Thank you, Caroline. First of all, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this webinar. And I'm really honored to be invited again by Boostlingo to talk about our project. I will start with a brief introduction about CCHI and my role there, and then I'll talk about the project, which we called Interpreter Testing Revolution, because we truly believe this is some unique and revolutionary opportunity to actually study the interpreting profession. So my name is Natalya Mytareva. I'm the executive director of CCHI, the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters. And I was one of the founding commissioners, and one of the foundational principles that we had when we started this organization is we wanted to create a certification for every interpreter in the United States that works in healthcare. And as you can imagine, it's a very daunting task with many pieces to it, because there are interpreters of different languages. Interpreters work in different modalities, face-to-face, over the phone, video. There are sign language interpreters, spoken language interpreters. So it's a big elephant. And we decided that we'll eat the elephant like everybody does, piece by piece. So we started with making sure we have the solid foundation for every program. Our mission was to create a national, valid, credible, and vendor-neutral certification program, which means we wanted to create the standard that's recognized across the United States in different states. So that's why it's national. Valid requires us to follow certain standards for certification programs of other professions. And for that reason, we sought and got accreditation from the National Commission for Certifying Agencies, NCCA. We accredited 2 of our main exams, and I'll talk about that in a second. The credibility is important in our industry because we're still a very young profession compared to professions of doctors, attorneys, teachers. So we need to establish the proper sequence of things, right? We started with creation of the Code of Ethics, and it was formalized and adopted as a national Code of Ethics for medical interpreters. That happened in 2004. Then we started developing different training programs, and I'm saying we because you, me, we all participated in that process. Then in 2009, CCHI was formed, and we administered our first exams in 2011, and now we're ready to celebrate our 10th anniversary next year. So we, building it block by block. And vendor neutral is important because we want to make sure that this product, that certification program, really is independent from any group of stakeholders, including interpreters or interpreter trainers or language companies or healthcare providers. So it truly is a organization where we talk and engage all stakeholders, but we keep the actual certification by itself independent of any interest. And that's our sole purpose. We don't have any other agendas as far as to educate or to be, better employability service. No, we deliver the national certification exams. And this starting last year, 2017, the commissioners who are volunteers and representing these different stakeholders started thinking of what should we do next. What is which piece we should tackle next of that big elephant, the certification. And we decided we're ready for creating an interpreter skills test that is independent of the language in which the interpreter works. We call it English to English, or EtoE for short, interpreter skills test. And today I'll give you the explanation of the whole project and the update on where we are in this journey. The reason we started is because we believe that certification should be inclusive and fair to interpreters of any language. If you are an interpreter of Spanish, of Kenya, Rwanda, French, Russian, Swahili, sign language, you should have the opportunity to prove your professionalism, to prove your qualifications, regardless of that language. And it should be fair by the principle that no interpreters should work harder for getting that certification just based on the language that they speak. These two principles guided the creation of our program from the very beginning, but of course we had to start with something. And our first step was creating the English knowledge exam that tests the knowledge about healthcare interpreting. We got that exam accredited through NCCA. It's called Core Certification Healthcare Interpreter. It is the first step into the certification journey for interpreters of many languages. However, at that time, it was created in 2010 and first administered starting 2011. We know just by taking an English multiple choice exam, you cannot really say that you are an interpreter. So we started developing language specific exams. And the first language specific exam, of course, was for Spanish, because in the United States, that's the majority language of non-English speaking patients and interpreters by the extension. So we created the oral performance exam, which actually tests the candidate's ability to do the job of interpreting between two languages. Also, at the same time as we were creating the knowledge exam in 2010 and started administering in 2011. Then in 2012, we added Arabic and Mandarin with the help of the grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And looking at this, it seems that we have everything covered, right? We have these three big languages that have the oral performance exam, and the rest of the languages can take the core CCHI exam and get certified at that level. So why did we decide to move forward and not, stay at the same place? Well, first of all, as we all know, written exam is not enough, right? If I pass the written exam in English, even though we do require candidates to submit their language proficiency documentation, and I submit my documentation that I'm proficient in Russian, you still don't know, can I interpret in Russian or not? I have many friends of different interpreters of different languages, and I have seen interpreters who, not interpreters, speakers of my language, Russian, or of other languages, who are perfect speakers of Russian and of English, but they're not interpreters. And that written test really won't test that ability. There are language proficiency tests for many other languages, right? There are language proficiency tests for almost 100 plus languages in the United States through different companies. There are ACTFL scale that is administered by one organization that is widely accepted. There are private exams by companies like Alta, Language Line University, Syricom. Many other companies have their language proficiency exam, Marty, and they test this person's ability to speak that language, right? But regardless of all that, patients for whom we interpret, they deserve to have a certified interpreter regardless of what language the interpreter speaks and what language the patient speaks, because ultimately the purpose of our profession is to help two parties, patients and providers, to communicate effectively. And at this time, when we have these 3 oral exams for Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin, it is fair to think that patients of those languages have a chance to get a certified interpreter, while patients of other languages, let's say you're speaking Swahili or Kanjibal or Farsi, those patients cannot get an interpreter whose ability to interpret was tested in the United States at this time. And that's why we decided this is the time to tackle this problem. We also looked at our situation from a business perspective. If we look at the certificates growth, and now that we've been in existence 10 years almost, we have the data. And this is the first top line with growth fastest is CCHI certificates. So in 2011, the first group was 226 people. And as of today, we have 2,840 Spanish certified healthcare interpreters. This yellow line is the core CCHI certification for interpreters of all the other languages. And you can see here we had started with 100 and now we have 900. So over the years, over 8 years, we only got 900. We know in the United States there are thousands of interpreters of all other languages that are practicing and being paid. That means that their qualifications as of today have not been verified by an independent, valid examination. And that's something that we are trying to, wanting to change through this project. If you look at the obvious path, right? We have the Spanish exam, we added Arabic, Mandarin. Let's start adding one exam at a time. Korean, Vietnamese, Russian, French, etc. But when we look at these 2 lines, 2012, that's when we started administering Arabic and Mandarin. And over the period of 7 years, we got 155 Mandarin certificates and 95 Arabic certificates. And development of an oral exam is an expensive proposition. It's over $100,000 per language. So no business could invest this much money and then get 95 certificates 7 years down the road. That's simply not a survivable foundation. And we take the profession seriously. We take our mission seriously. We want to exist forever so that all certifications that we are granting are recognized 20 years from now, 30 years from now. So that means that as an organization, we need to look at the business aspects of certification as well. That's not our main driving point, but we cannot ignore it when we see this discrepancy. So we really want to see if there is a way to create an exam that is applicable to all languages, not one at a time, because then we'll have the strength in numbers, and we would be able to, have a more feasible and reliable foundation for certification for interpreters of other languages. Also, let's think of how many of interpreters of specific languages these 900 certificates of course CCHI represent. This is the top 10 languages. And you can see here Russian is at 121. Vietnamese 81. I'm not going to read all of them, but ASL stands for American Sign Language because core CCHI exam is language neutral that allows interpreters of sign language, not only of spoken languages, to take it. And you can see some languages are predictable, right? Russian, Vietnamese, Korean, Cantonese, those are predictable. But look, Nepali ranks number 7 on this among the top 10 languages, and obviously, the reason is more about probably Monipali interpreters knowing about that certification than, let's say, Kiswahili interpreters or Armenian interpreters or Farsi interpreters. I don't know, right? I don't know the reason for it, but it is clear that if we start creating, let's say, even an exam for Russian, Vietnamese, and Korean, the top three, we cannot even start. Because to develop a valid exam that meets the modern psychometric standards, we need to have about 50 subject matter experts to write it, because there are several iterations, several processes. Then we need about 200 people to have them take the pilot. Then to get the statistically valid data that validates that exam, and then we can start administering that exam. So if we create a Russian exam, we can't start because we don't have 250 people here. But even let's say we have them tomorrow, then how many are going to take it afterwards? After we invest all that time in creating the exam, how many time? And then should we create Somali and Nepali, or should we go French? Because you see, there's no French here. Yet there are many French-speaking patients from around the world in the United States. So this data shows us, because these number 900 is still pretty low, when you start breaking it down by individual languages, the task of creating an oral performance exam for each language is unrealistic. Yes, we can probably do this 9, right? But that would be with the investment from outside. There's no way we could generate the income to invest in creation of these exams. However, if we look at this same problem with the way there is still something that makes us an interpreter and not just a bilingual speaker. And if we can test that ability, then we could get an exam that is good for any language and is uniform and fair and inclusive. However, there are obviously other challenges with creation of exams for languages of lesser diffusion, of lesser demand. Those are these core CCHI candidates that we cover by that title. Well, defining the pool size of potential certificates, that's what I kind of explained to you already, because for any exam that we create, we need to make sure that we have enough people to create it. But ultimately, how many certified interpreters in that specific language will be able to earn livelihood as interpreters in healthcare in the United States? How many interpreters of that language does industry need? There's no data collected by anybody right now. I know we have representatives of different language companies on this webinar, and if we ask each one of you, you will say, yes, if I have 10 Farsi interpreters, I will be covered. So somebody still needs then to collect the data from across the country. And do we need 100 Farsis that are certified? 1,000? If it's 1,000, then possibly we could create the exam. If it's 100, then that's economically unfeasible. The other challenge is the absence of educational opportunities for studying these languages, which I call of limited diffusion or lesser demand, because there are two aspects to it, right? Like, for example, Japanese in California will not be a limited diffusion language, but in Akron, Ohio, where I'm from, it is a language of lesser demand, because we don't have that many Japanese speakers in our city who do not speak English, right? So that's why they covered both through that LLD abbreviation. But if I wake up today and decide that I want to become a Japanese interpreter, I could do that, right? There are several universities across the United States which would allow me to start learning Japanese and then finish at the level that would allow me to become an interpreter. But if I want to become a Farsi interpreter, a Burmese interpreter, Nepali, Swahili, then I can't, because there's simply no programs that will teach me to the level. Yes, there are tapes, there are programs that will teach me to manage traveling to those countries, to say hello, but they will not teach me to the level that I could interpret. So in order to get education in these languages, I'll have to go outside of the United States. And that already becomes an, uneven burden on interpreters of those languages compared to interpreters of Spanish, Russian, Japanese, who could get additional education in the United States. So creating an exam in their specific language includes the challenges that we won't have candidates who have educational degrees in those languages. We also have the challenge of the lack of written resources in some of these languages, or valid written resources. If we take, I'm not even speaking of indigenous languages of the United States or Central and Latin America. Let's take a language of lesser diffusion, several languages of lesser diffusion from the country of Myanmar, Burma. The United States has a significant number of refugees from that country. The official language of education, higher education, especially in Myanmar, is Burmese. So all the medical textbooks are written in Burmese. If you are a speaker of Karen, Mon, Chin, you simply won't have any document in writing from your own country that has this terminology in those languages. I'm not saying that terms don't exist. Some of them don't, but some exist, but there is no valid resource for it. So candidates who prepare for this language-specific exam will have harder time than Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin interpreters finding resources to help them prepare for the exam. In some cases, we are even dealing with the fact that they cannot even Google anything, right? I know 10 years ago that was not an issue. The Google search didn't produce you that much help in some instances, especially for professional level interpreting. But now, any interpreter of Spanish or Russian, they don't know a term, they type in some keywords describing that term, and they can find a pretty close equivalent, or they can construct one based on the articles or the publications in their country about that disease, even if it's a brand new technology, for example, like CoolCap for newborns who are born with head trauma. When I was doing the research recently on a Russian website, they do use that technology already in Russia. So I was able to construct a good enough translation of CoolCap until the community would agree on what is the standard translation for that term. But for some languages, if you do the search even in Burmese, in Nepali, in Thai, you will not find enough medical resources. There may be some chats on Facebook, but not articles from the universities or medical schools or hospitals in those countries. Again, in Burma, for example, you will have it in Burmese, but not in Karen, Mon, Chin. So by trying to figure out but by taking all this into account, we're faced with the problem that not languages are equal, both globally because of the lack of the online presence and locally in the United States of the opportunities available to them. So how do we create an inclusive and fair certification program for every interpreter without trying to show unintended bias and make it harder for some interpreters to get certified than the others? So those are the other thoughts that were going through our minds. When we look at the testing, because there are different language proficiency tests for some of these languages, right? You go search, there are many ACTFL tests, ALTO tests, and other language tests in these languages. But, and I'm not saying that these tests, don't take me wrong, I'm not saying that these tests are, I'm not assessing those tests. I don't know about them to assess them, but these are the questions we can ask. So if we have a person who passed the language proficiency test, we know that they can speak, let's say, Kenya, Rwanda, but can that person interpret? We don't know, because language proficiency test is not designed to test the interpreting ability. It's designed to test the ability of the candidate to speak, listen, sometimes read, depending on which level they took. Now, who are the raters for the language proficiency tests? You understand that even the most, if we take TOEFL, it's in English, right? If we take, it's created and it's piloted by many candidates. It goes through different process. However, it's still a proprietary exam, and we still don't know who the raters are. But when we take exams, and I'm taking ACTOFL and their exams as an example here, when they created, let's say, Spanish, obviously they had tons of pilot takers, iterations, and have many raters. But if, let's say, they have an exam for Kenya, Rwanda, probably in the United States, they may have 10 people who have the ability to, and educational level to be the raters. But what are the chances that all these 10 raters will stay, let's say, with that company for enough years to continue improving their rating abilities? So more realistically to say that any commercial exam that we have right now in the United States, or government exam for that matter, because State Department, Department of Defense, they also need interpreters, and they do assess them, and they have their own tests. But then the raters probably still is one or two people making the decision. And when we have only limited pool of raters, they may inadvertently start acting as gatekeepers, right? Making it harder for some candidates, or on the vice versa, they could make it easier. How often and how many tests they rate? Like, for example, we know there is a court certification exams for German, and they have about 2 candidates every other year. I'm exaggerating, but they said the number of German interpreters who take the court certification test are very few, even though the exam exists in the state of New York. So all these questions for interpreting tests that have fewer candidates create this other further quests. How objective is the scoring? If you only have one rater listening to the candidate and scoring them, how can you monitor their performance? Who is monitoring their performance? It has to be some person of the same language, right? Or there has to be some if you have 3 raters, okay, you can already run some reports, but when you have the reports for 3, just think of your math of your statistics class, that won't tell you much, because it's beyond the validity level. We also hear different recommendations about language proficiency levels that interpreters should have before they start interpreting. And most of the time they sound good. They sound logically as an appropriate recommendation, but there is no data proving that there is the correlation between a level in language proficiency test and the ability of the person to interpret, because the language proficiency test is simply not meant for that. And what I mean by the level, ACTOFL test assigns you different level: medium advanced, high advanced, or and all this intermediate. So that's what I'm talking about as far as the level of language proficiency. And then ultimately the question becomes, if the test is developed by a private entity, doesn't matter if it's a government or a company, international, domestic, but they have the right to their trade secrets, and we as public don't know how many SMEs they had, subject matter experts, how frequently do they update the tests, how do the items on the test perform psychometrically. I know these companies review these reports, and we have to trust that they are doing the right decisions based on these reports. But this is not something that is overseen by anybody. What you have with the entities as certification boards like CCHI, or if we take the comparison to other profession, nursing boards or medical board for doctors, because they are accredited through a third party, NCCA, they have to submit reports and they have the oversight. So if, like for example, we submit reports on an annual basis about how our exams perform psychometrically, and if NCCA psychometricians would tell us, so far that hasn't happened, would tell us that there's something not meeting the best criteria, that means we'll have to change the test, etc. But we do have the recommendations on how frequently we must update the test, and so to have the exam that is inclusive, fair and valid for every interpreter means that we need to create it based on the highest standard, on the standard we apply to the most common frequently used exam, Spanish, and not lower the standard because there are fewer raters, fewer people who will take it. The standard should be the same. So we started thinking as commissioners, what if? We know what's the best thing is. We know the sliced bread, the best thing would be to create dual language interpreter skills exams in Swahili, Burmese, Nepali, etc. But it's impossible at this time. So what's the next best, since the sliced bread, is the monolingual interpreter skills exam. I know it sounds like, how can monolingual exam test anything? But you're forgetting that our brain is a very complicated and interesting thing. And we decided that we need to figure out what makes a bilingual speaker an interpreter, or a translator for that matter, because ultimately I've worked in my previous job. I was the manager of interpreting and translation services at a nonprofit refugee resettlement agency, and I was managing translations and I was managing interpreters, and I would hire them and have different performance evaluations, and I could see eventually that some individuals who speak two languages good at the time of recruitment will not perform good as interpreters and translators, and others would. And so, all things equal, what makes one person who speaks two languages an interpreter? There must be some cognitive skills in that these individuals who are interpreters and translators possess that a bilingual speaker who was not trained does not possess. And how do we discover these cognitive skills? Well, we cannot relate on anecdata. We all gather together at conferences, we talk, and if those of you who are managers of interpreting services, you have your own ideas of which recruit will make it and stay with the company and which don't, but it really is guesswork. We cannot continue in our profession and in this day and age rely on guesswork and anecdata. I always thought, and always thought that my main contribution I could make is to help pushing the profession towards what's considered a profession, right? And I believe that interpreting is a very complex profession. We spend years learning the languages. We spend the rest of our lives perfecting the languages and our interpreting skills. So if we want to be taken seriously by doctors, by nurses, by attorneys and judges, we need to have data and evidence proving that we have research about our profession and our exams are based on that research, not on lovely people getting together and creating some exam. And again, I'm trying to be here both humble and about our own beginning, my own beginning. I did participate in many brainstorming sessions about what is best, but it's time that we move on to hard data. We started with doing a national environmental scan. We wanted to see what do other people think? Because on the commission, we have 13 commissioners and I'm a staff person, but 14 people cannot make this kind of decisions. So we, in the fall of 2017, we started conducting different focus groups and interviews with experts, 40 experts from across the United States who represent different stakeholders. We had interpreter trainers, and I'll just give you a couple of names that you would recognize. Cindy Roth, who is the author of Bridging the Gap, and Cindy is consultant on many other projects. We worked with Karen Rushke. She was certification standards and certification co-chair of the NCIHC, National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare, with Enrique Artemani, who is the chair of NCIHC. We had representatives of language companies from such companies as CLI, TransPerfect, Marty, to just name the most well-known, but there are others. We had interpreters interpreters of sign language. So we talked to the state of Washington, who has some elements of the screening tests that we thought are interesting and that we hope to incorporate our study. We talked with Dr. Fu. So we've conducted this environmental scan, and the consensus of across the country was that yes, we should take a study to determine whether we have cognitive skills as interpreters that separate us from bilingual speakers. So the next step for us was to convene a national task force. So this was started this spring in June, and we got 22 experts. Some of them are the same as from focus groups. Some of them are new. Most of them are educators of interpreters at different levels, from private companies to colleges, universities, to being consultants in the industry for many, many years. And we tasked them, and their task is to create recommendations for writing that English to English interpreter performance exam, so that when we actually have the subject matter experts write it, they have this expertise of all these individuals who have years of experience of teaching interpreters to build the exam on. And based on that, we published first in May, we published the white paper and about the EtoE project that is a summary of all the focus group discussions that we had. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's fascinating, 20-some pages reading. You can find it if you go on our website, CCHI.certification.org, and then /EtoE, and there you can download this PDF and read it. So that's the first document, but we're almost ready to publish the recommendations of the National Task Force. They'll come out probably early January. That will describe the actual elements of the study that we are going to conduct. So I hope by now you're curious to know what exactly would this study do, right? The purpose is to determine whether interpreters possess interpreting cognitive skills that are responsible for a successful conversion of meaning from one language into another. So we really want to see this cognitive skills at the cognitive skills level. And the second question becomes, can such cognitive skills be measured in a monolingual format? And of course, because we're in the United States, we're doing it in English. But if the concept works, that means that the same concept could work internationally. If you're in Korea, you will create that similar exam in Korean for your students to know whether they could become, or interpreters, whether they could become interpreters of English, French, German, but from Korean. So those are the two huge questions we're asking. It's not that these questions have never been asked before. They have. And we've had instructors in Europe, and especially in the interpreting schools in Geneva and in Paris also, that have asked these questions and did some minor research based on the students, comparing the performance of the students and some practicing interpreters. However, the sample size for those studies were always very small, and by very small I mean anywhere from 5 to 30. So that's the challenge that we want to overcome, and the plan to conduct the study is the following. First, we create the actual test, English to English test. We will call for volunteer subject matter experts who are practicing interpreters of different languages, and that call is actually coming out this week. Most of you will see it on our website, but if you're subscribed to our newsletter, you will get it through the email from us. And if you're an interpreter who's interested in helping us, please participate. And these SMEs will create that English to English test based on the National Task Force recommendations. Then we will need to pilot the test. And the way we're going to do it, we'll get 300 volunteer interpreters of Spanish, Mandarin, and Arabic. They will take the English to English tests that would be created and the regular certification test. Because this test has been in existence already for several years, we have good data of its validity. We will look and analyze and compare at that moment whether the first of all, if a person passes EtoE test, do they also pass the Spanish test? If there is a correlation, one-to-one correlation, that's wonderful. That means that the English to English test really tests your interpreting abilities because the same person passes both tests or fails both tests, right? If we don't find that level of correlation, then we will look at different components. Let's say if the person on EtoE test passed certain question, certain item, and they passed as a result Spanish test, that means that that item tests the crucial cognitive skill that's important for them to be successful on the bilingual test. So this is what we think is revolutionary. All the elements have been touched upon before, but not on the scale. Now we have 300 people that we will test, and they did not have a valid baseline comparison against which to compare the performance on that English to English exam, which we have thanks to the data from the administering the current exams for Arabic, Mandarin, and Spanish. Let's talk about what actual subskills will this EtoE test assess. Because, all right, it's in English. What can actually we test in English? Well, number one, active listening and reading in English, right? But still, if you're able to, active listening is the brain function of focus, of being able to really hear what is said. It doesn't matter what language you're doing it in, right? So active listening and active reading is a cognitive skill beyond specific language. Anticipatory listening and reading, in other words, you're hearing somebody saying something and you know how they finish the sentence, right? That's also an ability of the brain that doesn't matter what language it is. Of course, if it's your native language, you're able to finish the sentences faster than if it's your second language, but still, the ability is the same. Message analysis. Again, it's a metacognitive skill. It's the skill that crosses the boundary of the language. Some person reads the text and they cannot retell it to you. The other person reads it and they can tell it, well, there are three main points and the one sub point, and the conclusion is. That's what message analysis, and that could be tested in English. Comprehension of oral and written text. That will be English specific, of course. But even if we figure out one side of the language, that will be good. Retaining and recalling information, short-term memory. As an interpreter, you know that you either have it or you don't, right? And that means when we begin our career, we probably ask people to repeat things quite often. And then as we get, up the ladder in our mastery, we may let people talk for 20 minutes. That's the long consecutive, and because our short-term memory has this capacity to stretch, but that's a skill that we can test in one language. If it exists in one language, it does exist in the other language. Mental agility in general, to be able to see how you can say the same thing shorter because you're interpreting simultaneously and you don't have the time. So that's something that, again, is beyond the specific language. Accurate reformulation of the source speech or text in the same language. In other words, fidelity to the message. It's one of those, teaching exercises when you give people, here is one sentence and here are two versions. Which of these two versions is closer to the original? That is something that we do as interpreters. We look for what is the equivalence and meaning, and that's what we can test in one language. Understanding of the concept of register, right? If you give three synonyms, for, let's say, swelling of the glands or large glands. Swelling is a higher register, large glands is a low register. Now, my example is not very good off the top of my head, but this is, again, your cognitive ability to discern the formality of the language that you're able to do if you're a trained interpreter or translator, and if you're just a bilingual speaker, you won't be able to always tell that. Attention sharing skills, right? Listening and speaking at the same time. It happens in both languages. Self-monitoring. Are you actually hearing what you're saying? Are you able to self-correct? Do you modulate your intonation? Fluency in English. That will be, of course, in English because it is an English text. But even if we get the fluency in lexical, grammatical level, or speech production level, that's will be already a plus compared to what we have now on the core CCHI exam, which is purely multiple choice. And then speech quality in English. We won't know how good the person's Burmese, French, or Russian is, but we will know how in pronunciation-wise, prosody-wise, and pace-wise, good the English is. And this is something that would be, again, an addition to the written core CHI exam. So if we have this exam really working in English, we will have all these things already tested. But these are the skills, but what are the actual elements? What would the exam look like? What questions would we have here? Well, paraphrase, or what we can very fancily call monolingual or intralingual reformulation. So if I will tell you the phrase, not all that glitters coruscates with resplendence, you will tell me not all that glitters is gold, right? So that's the paraphrase. Shadowing, that's a very common exercise done when you are studying simultaneous interpreting, where you're just repeating after the speaker the same thing they're saying, not interpreting, just repeating it in English. There is a whole group of instructors in especially Europe who think that shadowing is the main skill of interpreter. Shadowing predicts the interpreter's ability to be successful interpreters, but yet there is another equally important school in Europe which thinks that no, shadowing doesn't predict everything. Paraphrasing ability predicts, but nobody has done the comparison or study of those. Memory capacity, and on the exam it will look, first you're asked, you listen to a sentence which has, let's say, 15 words, and you'll need to repeat them. Then it will be 20 words, 35 words. So that would be testing. If, for example, we find that the best thing that predicts who passes the Spanish exam is if the person could repeat 35 words, wouldn't that be easy? Then let's say if you're a language company, you create your own quick recruitment screening test, which only asks people one thing, to repeat in English 35 words. And those candidates who repeat them successfully, you hire them, and then you invest in their training and polishing them and certification. And those who cannot, you don't. Wouldn't that be wonderful? We will know after this test, after this study. Close. That's another anticipatory ability type of exercise that we all did in school at different times. So you have, let's say, a sentence and there is a blank for one word in the middle, and you're supposed to fill that blank. Sometimes teachers will give you other words to choose from to fill that blank, and sometimes they don't, and you have to predict which word is missing. So maybe this will be the best thing to predict your ability to pass the dual language exam. Listening and reading comprehension and English speech production. It's normal elements of the language proficiency testing, but since we're doing this study, we may as well include them and see if they mean anything in relation to the passing or failing the interpreting exam. And then bilingual or interlingual reformulation. That is kind of the what we call back interpretation or back translation, and some court interpreting screening tests use it. The screening test for medical interpreters in the state of Washington uses it, but again, there haven't been any comparative studies. And what this means is we hope we'll be able to do it technologically. So the candidates, the first thing they do in the exam, they listen to an audio file in English, and they consecutively interpret it into French, let's say. Then they do that memory capacity, shadowing, paraphrase, close, listening, and then the last item on the exam, they listen to their French recording and they interpret it back to English. And the raters will compare how many units of meanings they kept, from the original English. So that's the idea of what, I mean, there are more elements that we're considering to include in the exam, and the National Task Force will have the more detailed recommendation, but that's the idea of what that exam will look like. And we will be able, since we'll have the 300 test takers, we'll be able to analyze all these elements afterwards to whatever degree we need to. Who would benefit from this study? Well, obviously interpreters of all languages, because this study will tell us about our, what skills we need to possess, etc., regardless of the language. But obviously, interpreters of languages of limited diffusion, they will have the ability to be as proud of their achievements as Spanish interpreters are, who can say, well, I got tested not only the written test, but the oral test. The interpreters of languages of lesser diffusion could say, yes, I did the same thing. They didn't have the exam in Kiswahili or Kinyarwanda, but I took the English to English performance exam, and my cognitive skills are on the same level as yours. That's this element of us as professionals of pride. So we are the beneficiaries of this study. Interpreter trainers and educators. My career started as instructor of English at University for students of English and Russian interpreting and translation. I would love to see what the study shows, then I know how many exercises on clothes I should have. Or if we discover that they're useless to determine whether the interpreter could interpret, then I'll maybe spend more time doing paraphrase or shadowing. So interpreting trainers will have the data to build their curriculum on, and they could create good training, practical training, including online training, to teach people to become successful interpreters, regardless of the language. Language service companies, of course, as I already gave you one example, because this study is going to have public report with the data from it published, whatever results there, you could adjust and create your 5-minute screening tool to not waste the time on screening, hiring the interpreter, having them train, and after 3 months they quit, right? Or they don't quit, they love the job, but you get so many complaints about the interpreting that you don't know what is wrong. So this screening tool at least will let you know that the individuals are able to perform interpreting job. The rest, the behavioral patterns, etc., that's manageable. Or even language proficiency in English could be improved, accents could be improved. But if the cognitive skills are there for interpreting, then it's a good candidate and it's a good investment for the company. And professional overall, again, to put us on the map with the same level as doctors, nurses who talk about evidence-based medicine, and every time they talk about it, we will be talking about evidence-based interpreting. That all our trainings, our certifications, they're not come from anecdata, they're based in research. And ultimately, the reason we exist is to help patients and providers to communicate. Patients of any language will have confidence in their interpreter, and the same thing, the providers, they will know that their reputation and their liability is in the hands of interpreters that have been screened, tested, and proven to have the ability to do interpreting, regardless of the language. They won't need to lower their expectations because an interpreter speaks some language, because that obviously would defend the interpreters of that language. That why would you treat me as if I am not as educated as a Spanish or Chinese interpreter? I have the same abilities, and we will now give these tools to everybody to do that. So how can you get involved? Obviously, you probably by now hear how passionate I personally am about this study and how we all feel at CCHI, but we need support of everybody. We cannot do that alone. We rely at multiple steps for your personal involvement. If you're a certified interpreter, we need you to volunteer to help us write the exam, because for the process to be valid, it needs to be the exam needs to be written by practicing interpreters, and we want to create a group that has as many languages there as possible. So core CHI, CHI of different levels, as diverse the group is, the better the test quality will be. If you're a Spanish, Mandarin, or Arabic interpreter who is not certified yet, we would love and need you to participate in the study. In other words, to take 2 exams. The good thing is you will be taking the real exam and you'll earn your certification, and the English to English exam that you will take, this will be a contribution to the profession. You don't have to take it, but we hope we'll find 300 individuals who will be able to be our study participants. And if you're a language company manager, that you have these interpreters that you always wanted to get certified but never had the time to really push for it, this is the time. If they would volunteer for the study, we will have incentives for them to make sure that we thank them for their time. And if your language company, become our research partner. This is an expensive project, as you can imagine, and we now started the crowdsourcing campaign to raise money for this study. We are running it on the Indiegogo platform, which is a wonderful platform allowing us to see real time how many donations are coming and how many people contribute. So I ask everyone, no donation is small, no donation is large enough, because we really want to do it right. And right now, you see, that was last night. We've had some more donations since that time. We have interpreters donating $10. I see interpreters of different languages doing it. We have we started seeing some language companies donating. We had a couple of $500 donations, but we obviously hope that you would donate more. And with that, you need to find us how to get to this place on CCHI's homepage, cchicertification.org. You can go and this project EtoE and you click donate now. Or if you go to Indiegogo.com, you do the search for Interpreter Testing Revolution and you get to our campaign. And Caroline, do we have any questions?
Let me go ahead and check. Thank you so much, Natalya, for that wonderful presentation. This is a topic, obviously, that touches everybody in the language industry. So it's something that I love to talk about, especially towards the end of the year when we're in a giving spirit. So let me just check here quickly. Questions. We're running a little bit out of time here, but I did get a question in the beginning on how many, if you happen to know how many Spanish interpreters are certified with CCHI?
Well, right now, and granted that you getting the freshest data, we just started releasing this course for the last testing window. We have around 2,890, maybe 91, I don't remember, but it's almost 3,000 CHI Spanish.
Wow. Okay, that's great. Then I had just a couple comments here, just from an Arabic interpreter is interested in volunteering with you, so I'll probably give her your contact information so she can speak with you directly. And anyone else who's interested, please do reach out. My email is caroline@boostlingo.com if you don't know already. And yeah, so please stay tuned for the next webinar. Won't be until the new year. It's going to be episode 10, Ideas by Interpreters, with one of our seasoned Arabic interpreters talking about best practices and professionalism. So thank you so much. Enjoy the holidays. And thank you, Natalya, again for being here. It's been a pleasure listening to your presentation.
Thank you once again for inviting me, and everyone, thank you for coming and spread the word about our project.
Yes, will do. All right. Thanks, everybody. Happy New Year.
Happy holidays. Bye-bye.